And even before that, talking about where our revenue really comes from. So 53% of our revenue comes from local property taxes, excuse me, on average. 7% comes from federal funds, and 40% comes from the good old state of Illinois.
I'm sorry, did you say 70% comes from federal?
7.
7.
Yeah, 53 local,
say, wow.
7 federal, right, and 40
740.
states.
Okay,
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. So for a number of years leading up to 2017, we had general state aid as the main funding formula in Illinois. It was viewed as inequitable, inadequate in terms of the funding, how the money flowed through 2 districts. Essentially a broken formula. So they decided let's get back to it. Educators sat with legislators leading up to 2017. Excuse me. And oops, I'm sorry. Moved the wrong one. And developed what's now known as the evidence-based funding formula. It's about 3 years in the making, and like I said, it was enacted in August 2017. So we're going to run through the evidence-based funding model. This presentation, a version of this presentation, was presented at the last board meeting in the financial update section of that meeting. So that's why it's for review and update, since it was for the board at the time and anyone coming to that meeting. But anyway, it hits all the nuts and bolts that we'll need to hit to understand the formula. So we'll get right into it. There's 4 main components of the evidence-based funding model. It starts with the adequacy target. And what that essentially is, like I said, educators sat with legislators and developed the formula. It's all based on 26 research-based elements that are recognized to provide a high-quality education to this specific student demographics of a district at the ideal levels of class size, of staffing, ideal levels of support for diverse learners, and so on. Essentially, it's the pie in the sky. Here's what the total cost would be for a district for our district to provide that high quality education based on the research of the 26 research-based elements. So, that accounts for, like I said, class size and a variety. I'll describe it as appropriately complex. It's the whole formula is, in fact, it's complex in a good way, and that's not always what we get out of the state, but this one, they got it right, and it is working, and we'll kind of talk about that as well. The local capacity target is each district's access to local property tax revenue. It essentially takes what it calculates as revenue that we should be able to capture locally, and it looks at that compared to what revenue we're actually taking in a given fiscal year. I think the first year it started looking at 2015 levy year, and it's always going to be a few years behind that way. It's been vetted information. But in our case, I will say our calculated revenue that the state calculates is more than what we're actually taking in. That's to say, we could be taxing at a higher rate. We're choosing not to in the efforts of trying to keep that tax rate level historically. Then we go to the base funding minimum, and that is quite simply a hold harmless provision that ensures all districts receive at a minimum what they received the previous year. So you'll never go backwards. That was always the phrase used by legislators and the educators involved when the formula was discussed in public. So our base funding minimum for next year is equal to our base funding minimum this year plus any tier funding. And we'll talk about the tier funding in detail. It's also that next bullet point down, but it compounds on itself, if you can kind of see it that way. The tier distribution, that's determined, by, as it says, by each district's funding adequacy percentage. And that'll make more sense here in a little bit too. There's 4 tiers, 1, 2, 3, 4, and tier 1 are those districts in most need of additional state funding, given kind of their financial format, what access they have locally from local property taxes, a variety of factors along with those research-based elements. So now we have those 4 components. To really go through those in the short amount of time I did, it really doesn't do the formula justice. I mean, it's incredibly complex. The spreadsheet that the state kicks out to tell us what tier we're in, for example, it takes about a full 12 seconds or so to even open the Excel spreadsheet. There's so much data in there. But those are the 4 main components as identified by the professionals. So we'll kind of see how those now work together in that formula. Again, this is a simplified version, but this is the nuts and bolts here. So everything within the parentheses, the base funding minimum we just talked about, plus that. Okay, so again, the base funding minimum is the money we received in the previous year from the state, plus the local revenue that we captured through the local capacity target, plus a small amount of revenue from the corporate personal property replacement tax. I say small. Ours is small relative to most districts. It's about $250,000. So that number in total, the total available financial resources for our district divided by our adequacy target. So again, the adequacy target is the total cost to be able to provide a high quality education at ideal levels for all those 26 research-based elements. And that will result in our adequacy percentage. Excuse me. So if we throw up our real numbers there, our total financial resources as recognized or as identified in the formula for this I guess it was last year's numbers for money this year, just over 22 million. That $33.5 million number is that, again, that total cost that we aspire to. I think it was said at one time, and Lindsay, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the state identified that it's probably maybe a 15, 20-year outlook to try to reach that point, all the while getting money through the formula and additional tier funding and so on. But we have a ways to go, is the point.
So when the state passed the evidence-based funding law, and it was finally passed into law in August of 2017, the overarching goal is that all districts are moving toward their adequacy target, but that it's a long journey, and it's going to take consistent, intentional, and years of proper funding for the formula to get districts to their adequacy target. So what I had originally heard was kind of 12 to 15 years. We're 3 years in. We don't, well, really 2 years in. The state's working on the budget right now, and we'll know soon what that's going to look like. So the whole premise was you can't do this all at once. You can't. It's been the financial system has been broken for a long time, and so it's also going to take a long time and a lot of really consistent efforts to get it back on track.
So they're saying we need $33 million. So how are they going to get to that number? I don't know if you're going to talk about that, but how do they you say over 15 years? How are you going to? I mean, what does that mean?
Well, certainly it's the choices that our legislators make and appropriate toward K-12 funding.
So most of it's coming from the state.
Right. So
yes,
so interestingly, I should
40% of it is now.
But they're gonna keep bringing that up.
Well, so for us, that looks different for every school district. And so for us, our percentage of funding that we get from the state is actually up close to 50%, right? What did you just say?
The state amount's 40, was it 40? That's right.
Yeah, he said
Lori,
40.
I'm
That's
sorry,
okay, that's okay.
Can't participate.
Oh, okay.
Yep. We're right at 40% from state funding. So to Lindsay's point, the pressure is on the legislators to continue to allocate more funds into the education funding formula. They put those 3 years into developing that formula now. The pressure's on those legislators no one wants to see this fail at this point because of, so much time they put into it. So that's what's going to be required. And the minute they don't add additional funding to that, they will hear about it, certainly from the entire state and teachers, administrators, board members, and so on. So
So that 60, I'm sorry, that 66 and some odd percent is what the goal is to get to, or is that where we're at now?
That's where we're at right now. Yeah.
Okay.
So that is
Okay.
Great question.
What percent did we start at?
So
Yes, I have to reiterate. I'm sorry, 3 seated board members cannot participate in this meeting. You have to observe tonight. So I have to just reiterate that.
Yep.
If you want to write a question down, I'll ask it.
Can you ask that?
that will be, everything will be addressed in the presentation.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your question.
It's easier for me to follow along
Yeah, please. Yeah, thank you.
as we're going, so.
So that 66.09% is our adequacy percentage, and that then determines our tier distribution and the tier distribution of the other 851 school districts in Illinois. So again, we bring over that calculation over to the next page, and we'll focus on the tier distribution. Specifically, we talk about the four tiers. Tier 1, again, being those districts that are in need of the most additional funding. So we're at 66.09%. The cutoff for districts to fall between Tier 1 and Tier 2, 60% or 66% rather. We are one of we might be the district that just missed Tier 1 in terms of getting additional funding. Oh, I accidentally hit that. So it is what it is, though. You know, every district has to be somewhere. Now, that threshold, it's dependent upon how much money as it says, the state appropriates each year in tier funding. For this current year, the appropriation was $350 million. Unfortunately, $50 million was, I guess, scraped off the top and sent to, I say CPS, I think it was more for private school scholarships from the state, unfortunately. So that would have otherwise been divvied up among the state as well, but that ended up happening somewhat in the 11th hour. And I do wonder if that would have stayed, if that would have changed kind of how things played out, but it didn't, and is what it is. Okay, so now we'll talk about where we fall in the tiered funding. It's a ranking of all the FY19 Champaign-Ford County tier designations. So these are all the school districts that are in our regional office of education. So that's why I took this ranking. But again, we just missed that threshold of 66%. Only 3 districts in Champaign-Ford counties that were identified as needing more additional state funding than Mahoma-Seymour School District. So that's kind of interesting. It may surprise some people. I mean, it's, you know, our just given our financial format and what we have access to locally, you know, like I mentioned before, in that local capacity target, we could be capturing more locally, but in the efforts of trying to keep that tax rate level, we haven't. It recognizes all those things, and it's, like I said before, appropriately complex. Complex in a good way there. So
those schools,
yes.
like Prairie View Ogden is 96% funded
that means
of their target of
when it looks at
our
their
33
target,
million.
exactly. Yeah,
How do they get there?
that's a great question. It's important to note that every district on this list has their own story, and to even compare one to the next is difficult. But we do here just to kind of put some perspective there. I believe Prairie View Ogden has windmills, for example. So their access to local property taxes would be higher, which would increase that amount, requiring less than from the state, if that makes sense.
The other thing that gets factored into all of this is the demographics of your school district as well. So high poverty school districts are going to oftentimes, but again, this thing that makes the formula so unique is that every school district has their own unique story based upon property values, demographics of their students, the amount of what their local capacity is to fund. And so you will tend to see higher poverty schools fall into tier 1, and that would be the case of the 3 schools there. But when you've got very rich, when your EAV is very wealthy, the value of your tax base, then you're going to fall probably, you know, those other school districts like Prairie View, Ogden.
Absolutely. So while our tax base,
Ogden, I mean, let alone Ogden, like where does their tax base? I mean, I know you don't know the details of it, but
if we were to dig in, there's
what is the
reasons.
farmland? I mean, what?
It very well could be. Yeah, it very well could be. Sure. Yeah, and again, it's important to note, like Lindsay said, it doesn't always come back to their local property taxes in that format, but the demographics of the rest of the student
So they
population.
might be getting more state funding.
I'm sorry.
So they might be getting.
You're talking about Ludlow?
Yeah, like Ludlow.
So when they fall into tier 3, they won't
so
be
they're
getting.
not getting as much. So theirs is all coming more local than state level. Is that what that
That's
says?
that would be one theory. If you were to dive into their specifics, again, that spreadsheet that would take a while to open. If we were to really dig in each district, we could try to find that. Yeah, that would be.
Trent, is it because the district is already receiving that amount of money from the state or local values? Or
It
is
just comes back to that previous
Sure.
calculation.
So it could be any number. It could be
Sure.
any number of things.
So, for example, Monticello is not on this list. Let's just go back to Monticello is not on this list, but where I said we don't have as much corporate personal property replacement tax, they get an outstanding amount of money from the corporate personal property replacement tax, which then reduces their dependency on state funding. And that's given, I think, there's something there that produces that money. I think that's about as much as I know.
Yeah.
I know it's a unique district, which makes them look different on the evidence-based funding and accounts for it, which is
Because of the corporate personal property.
right. Yeah,
Basic tax.
it's a revenue source that we get from
So this number
that blue.
looks very, very different for school districts all over the state.
Is that something that each local government makes
No.
a decision on, or a school district?
It's a
state
tax.
tax.
It's a revenue that we receive in lieu of public entities previously being able to tax corporate personal property. So that they did away with that, but that's still a revenue source that we receive from the state. That way we're, I think, kept whole, so to speak. I think that changed in 1977 or sometime, you know, so. But again, that for us is about $250,000, which is a good amount of money. I think for Monticello, it's upwards of $4 million. So that changes.
Why is, like, I don't know, I'm sorry to dwell on that, but I don't.
Okay.
That lends itself to how complex it is and how it really, it digs into the nitty gritty for each district, which is the important part of the entire formula. So,
Is it because they're different county, like Monticello?
no, it would probably get into the weeds with that, and I apologize
I'm
for
sorry.
using that. But no,
I just
that's a great question.
But if it's a big component, like,
Yeah,
how do we get it?
big component for them. Yeah, no, it's not. It's nothing that a district can control, unfortunately.
Okay.
You know, it was some corporation in Monticello that they now receive a revenue.
Is it Pepsi? Pepsi was in Monticello.
Not sure
I
what
don't
it
know.
is.
Yeah, maybe railroad.
But it's some sort of corporation
Mhm.
set aside this money
Yeah.
for a school
That
district.
could previously be taxed, but now it can't because of a law in 1977.
Okay.
So, yeah, but
Okay.
that's, again, it's each district is unique, I think is the main takeaway there. All right, so we looked at the designations in Champaign-Ford counties. Added a little note there on the side. So again, we fell into tier two in FY19, which resulted for us in an additional $228,747. Like I said, if we would have been 65.99%, we would have fell into tier one, and that number would have probably been quite a bit more, but we didn't, and nobody can control that. So the formula it kicks out where the tiers are. So with our additional tier funding for this year, we did commit those funds to two of the research-based elements that have the highest return on investment, and that would be additional teachers to reduce class size. We did that in kindergarten this year and fourth grade this year, along with instructional coaches, which have a really high return on investment as per the formula, the research-based formula, you know, from the educators involved. So we're still in the process right now of waiting for what the tier funding will be for next year. I think that'll probably be in the next 2 months or so. I think it was in June of last year. We always hope it's earlier than later, that way we can plan, but that's unfortunately out of our control. So, but more on that to come. Okay, so what's next? We did hear in Governor Pritzker's budget address back in February that he's proposing $375 million for tier funding for next fiscal year. So again, this year we had 50 was shaved off, went to private school scholarships up in Chicago. So that left $300 million to go in the tier funding. Governor Pritzker's talking about 375. So that's a good thing. And it comes back to that pressure that is on the legislators to add additional, to appropriate additional funds for the formula. If that comes to fruition, then that's exactly what's happening. And that kind of takes us to the end of the evidence-based funding portion of the presentation. Any last questions on that?
Give me a second. I have to look at this.
It's like I said, to cover all that in 20 minutes, it's not doing the formula justice, but leading up to August 2017, Lindsay and I went to multiple webinars or conferences, workshops. Yeah, that would last an entire day for school administration, and even then they feel like they can only hit the tip of the iceberg there. So it is an absolutely good thing that we have the formula. That's another takeaway. I mean, it's the previous formula being broken. I mean, over a collection of 5 years, maybe 2012 to 2017, we were shorted about $4 million in state funding on a budget annually of about $24 million for the operating funds. That is detrimental. I mean, that's hard to, it's hard to come back from. Those are funds we'll never see. All the while, you know, continuing to provide an education that's viewed as pretty high quality in the area. So credit to our teachers for sticking with it and keeping on there. We'll go a little bit into the next topic, late property tax bills, which affects everybody in Champaign County that owns a home. By now, all folks have received their tax bill, and you have not yet. So, which means we haven't received the revenue for that. Again, it's 53% of our revenue in a given year, so that is very impactful. According to the county, yeah, the bills are set to be mailed out May 20th. That's at least a month and a half later than normal, which then again pushes those receipts to us back the same amount of time. They are saying they're going to be due June 20th. But what that means for school districts and other taxing bodies, it will absolutely leave a hole at the end of the fiscal year. It's frightening to even give these numbers because it kind of flips the whole thing on its head. Oh, there we go. All right, so normally in May and June for these spring tax bills, we get about 53% of our, 53% of our revenue comes from local property taxes. 53% of that comes to us in May and June. If that's pushed back a month and a half, we would probably only see that May payment, which is $4.2 million, which means that we won't see $4.8 million by the end of the fiscal year. Now, we will get it in
There's
July.
that fast of a turnaround?
There
When
is.
somebody gets their tax bill, they pay it, and then you get a check? It happens that quickly, in a month?
It's direct deposited, but yeah, it does.
Because I pay
Historically,
my property tax bill the last possible day.
yeah.
So,
We still manage to stay open without.
But I didn't know it was that turnaround, I thought it was
Sure.
just
Yeah,
collected,
I mean,
and then they just sent you one
in
big
previous
lump
years-
sum at the
Yeah,
end
historically,
of
the
all the
county's done an amazing job in previous years.
So they literally turns around that fast. And so,
previous years,
because of
yes.
people that pay their property tax early, then you get that money right away.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting.
Yeah, so and most people know this at this point, every 90% plus of the folks in the county buildings are brand new.
But I thought it was they didn't get the tax rate from the state out to the counties in time.
Yeah, that's what's in the public.
But that's not.
That could be the truth. Maybe that's the truth.
It's
Perhaps.
not, that we haven't
never
had this
seen that.
delay in years and other counties already have their tax bills out, so it is what it is.
Yep.
It's out of our control and
Yep.
we'll make it work, but I think what we're trying to stress is that this can really make our bottom line look very different on June 30th, which is the last day of our fiscal year, with
Yeah.
factors that are 100% out of our control. So there's a large chunk of money that's gonna be very late for us. We're-
And it would be for everybody.
For everybody.
Nothing
So think about that. Yeah, think about this.
All
Sham-
taxing bodies.
We talk about
School
Champaign.
districts, municipalities.
Again, an example, Champaign Unit 4, about 90% of their revenue comes from local property taxes. They have a lot of industrial property, commercial property, versus our, 53%. So when those payments come late for them, we're talking millions on top of millions that they won't see. So all those years they were more dependent on local property taxes as opposed to state funding, and state funding was lacking, and that didn't hurt them as much. But now when it's kind of flipped and funds are showing up late, that creates an issue for them. Which again is accounted for in the evidence-based funding formula just the same. So yeah, the message there being it'll be a tricky one to navigate. Has never happened before. I've been here 8 years. It's never happened before. And we run pretty lean, so we'll see more to come on that as well. Hopefully we get some good news. The next topic, procurement cards, also known as P cards. That is a pretty recent topic as of maybe 24 hours ago in a recent article in the News Gazette involving a local school district and their potential misuse of P cards. Over 80 cards at that district. Other area, large district has about 140 plus. We have far fewer, just to start. And we have some really strict firm policies in place and guidelines on how staff use those cards. We do have a board policy 4:55 that discusses in detail what, how those should be used, and then we also have a contract, essentially a contract that each staff member who needs to use a card must sign along with my signature, that then details out what they can use it for, if it's something outside of the purview of what that requisition is for, a requisition approved in the finance software, it comes back to us, so pretty firm and doesn't leave a lot of room for events like that are happening other places.
So there is oversight,
Oh,
like
Oh,
strict oversight in place.
yeah, not only internally, our auditors that come annually in July
Okay.
hit that hard, really hard. So, as they should, I mean, that's, so that's what we have going here.
And roughly how many P cards are in the district?
Yeah, we have 10 district cards, and then we have 6 that are in the buildings for activity fund use.
Mhm.
Of our 10, only 3 have individuals' names on them.
Okay.
Versus other districts where every single card has an individual's name
Mhm.
and are checked out, through the process that we have in place.
Yeah.
So,
Okay.
yeah. We just want to go ahead and address that because we've been very proud of how we've always handled that. Credit to my predecessor, Pam Lindsay, actually, for getting a lot of that nailed down during her career here. And we've continued those same procedures since then. So that board policy, for example, I think was adopted April 2009. So 10 plus years. I just want to lastly hit on this making sense of the district's dollars and cents. I've sent out a series of those over the last, seems like it's always odd years, 2013, 2015, 2017. I'm gonna do it again, right, 2019, starting, I guess it was 2 Fridays ago. So just in the effort of continuing to get good information out there to the public, we've had some good feedback. Hope that some folks take interest in the school finances. It can be kind of a dry topic, which is proof from the last 30 minutes, but at the same time, it's we're talking about our resources that allow us to maximize the opportunities for our students. So it's very important. And figured I'd kind of start with the basics with that, and then kind of build upon that. Hopefully, getting to the point where we can kind of talk about evidence-based funding and those newsletters. So.
Let us know if there's something
Yeah,
that you
please.
have specific questions about.
Yeah, what's out there
topic
that
Trent
folks
can
have
address
questions
with that.
about. Of course, I always welcome anybody to come in and talk about it too. And which I know it can be difficult. Jared, I
You
can't
might
get
be
in.
doing
get
basic
in.
math with me when I were to come
sorry.
and ask you. I said if I were to come in, you might be doing basic math with me to
Oh,
start
okay.
with, so.
No, you ask good questions about the formulas. So, yes. Any last?
So what is the plan to get to the 33? I mean, what else can you do other than rely on the state money? I mean, what else,
Yeah.
what other options are there?
Well,
But we don't
And
have,
they're saying that we need to operate at an ideal level.
and again, that's viewed in the formula and from districts, legislators, educators as kind of that pie in the sky. Let's aspire to this. And
But nobody really does it.
Well, no, everybody absolutely should. I mean, I know we that's why we put money into those elements that are viewed as having the highest return on investment, the biggest impact in the classroom for students, the reducing class size, the instructional coaches to,
so a couple of thoughts on our other sources of funding, because the evidence-based funding model addresses what we get from the state. So one of the other sources that we get is from the federal government, and that comes in the form of grants. A large chunk of that comes through the IDEA grant, which is meant for special education funding, and the other chunk comes through title grants. Title grants are primarily, so I'm going to give the broad overview, the picture here. We talked a little bit about it the other night in the parent-teacher advisory meeting briefly, but those grants, the amount that you get is largely based upon your poverty level. And so our poverty level is not particularly high. It's steadily, kind of slowly going up, but it's not skyrocketing. And overall, the figure that gets used in the evidence-based funding model is 23% for our school district, although our buildings vary from building to building. So, there are just obviously districts that have a much higher percentage of low-income students than we do, and you will see those school districts getting a much greater amount of money, depending on the size of the district, but also again the poverty level. So again, that is money, like we have no control over what we get. We do design a budget around how it's spent, but there's some really strict guidelines around that. So what that leaves out there that we can impact is how much money we pull in from local property taxes. And so if we wanted to increase our revenue, we could raise the tax rate. And so that's been a very conscious decision for years to not do that. In fact, our tax rate has been steady for about 20 years. Not your property taxes, I'm not saying they're staying steady, I'm saying the tax rate.
For the school district portion of it.
The school district portion of it, right, so your whole tax rate is library, Corn Belt, village, you know, all the taxing bodies, but our school district tax rate has remained very steady, but that is the one variable that we could control. But the thing about the evidence-based funding model is that if we were to raise the tax rate and say, hey, we want to pull in some more money to pay for whatever, more teachers, let's say. If we were to do that, then under how the evidence-based funding formula works, what would happen is that the formula would say, oh, well, Mahomet Seymour has a greater capacity to pay through local revenue, therefore they need less money from the state. And so there's a lot of moving pieces and it's a big kind of dance together, and we are not planning on raising the tax rate. I think I should say that very clear, at least that would be Trent and my recommendation. At the end of the day, it's up to the Board of Education when they approve the levy in the fall, or late in the year. But that is a variable that we do have control over. Mahomet Seymour is not subject to the tax cap law because we have a piece of property in Piatt County, which makes it exempt from, that little chunk keeps us exempt from
Oh my gosh.
the PTEL.
Where is
Oh my
that at?
gosh.
Southwest corner of the
It's a
district.
little tiny chunk.
So when Champaign County passed tax caps in, 15, 20 years ago, the county passed it, but Mahomet Seymour School District is exempt from that because of those pieces of property that are in Piatt County. So, there's a lot of moving parts and decisions to be made out of consideration for keeping your tax rate steady is important. It's been a priority of the school district. That's the one thing that we can control. But again, if we were to raise that, then there would be implications with the funding formula, which would likely result in us getting less tier funding. It would show that our adequacy percentage is actually higher, and it would push us deeper into tier 2.
Yeah, so the top number in this case would increase because we're increasing that local
Right.
tax portion, like Lindsay said, then increasing that adequacy percentage, putting us up in tiers. It's a good way to put it that it's a dance because one thing affects the next, and we're even dependent upon other districts in the state getting their information into the state. That way we can all hear about what tier we're in too. So everyone's at the mercy of each other, but everybody needs that state funding. So getting that information to the state's important.
And so then the other way to be able to raise the additional funds would, if I understand correctly, have more commercial or corporate personal property replacement tax. Like if we had more of that.
More commercial in property in our tax base, which would be unrelated to corporate personal property tax. But you make a good point in that we'd love to see that diversified even more in the community.
Chris, we really don't have control over the corporate personal property replacement tax.
Which is why I'm asking if that's what I'm understanding, or if it's what you're saying.
It's called CPPRT, just to call it something that's easier to say. That number is just given to us. Here's what you're getting this year. But to your point, if we were to add more commercial property in our tax base, it diversifies that tax base, putting less burden on residential taxpayers. So.
But then you also have at least people like me, who don't want to see so much commercialized in the area because we want to keep it small town feel. So again, it's that one thing that is the domino on the other. What do you do?
Right.
So without commercial growth, then the burden does fall on residential.
Right.
So it's a dance, a lot of
There's a
moving
dance.
parts.
We're seeing big old dance.
But what's the real potential to, increase businesses in town? Those of you that have been in it longer than I, we've only been here 12 years and,
Yeah.
I mean, there's not that many, what's
I'm
the
not
potential
sure
for
what
that?
There's always, there's always potential on the horizon, there's commercial properties that are being built, or, Sangamon was repurposed into commercial property,
Is that why
so-
it was Sangamon is for the commercial taxes?
Is that why we sold it?
Is that why, yeah?
No, we sold it because we don't wanna be stuck with a closed old school building. The people that happened to buy it were commercial real estate developers.
Yeah, the cost to continue using that building along with this was exorbitant.
Just the back half of it or the front half of it?
It needed some work overall.
But wasn't Sangamon newer than the junior high?
Part of it, and part of it was older than junior high.
So historically, has the funding been split up roughly like it is now, 7, 40, 53%?
Those percentages have been pretty consistent.
Pretty
If anything, it's gone, if anything, the state and local have been closer, maybe it's, 47, 50, lower 50s.
I don't think there's ever been a time when this district has not been reliant on local revenues as the majority of their funding. With
Yeah, absolutely.
50% or greater.
Yeah. So during those years where we're losing state funding and never seeing it again, just to give an example, we lost the same amount of money that Urbana did, given that their percentage, they're maybe 70% dependent on the state. Dependent on local property taxes, maybe 30% dependent on the state. So when they lost some of that general state aid funding, they lost the same amount that we did. Of course, it impacts us a little harder just in that, we're maybe half the size, or maybe a little bit bigger than half, 60% of their size, but the same amount of money coming off of our books hurts a little bit more. So, yeah, good question.
We're happy to take questions about anything, doesn't have to be finance, but I don't know if anybody has any other topics of
Well,
interest.
when you're talking like the email that you sent out about like the different buckets of money,
Mhm.
so like sports equipment and field equipment and that kind of stuff, what bucket does that come out of?
Sports equipment and field equipment.
Yeah, so like we got those above the scoreboard, we got these archways that have a Bulldog logo.
Those are paid for through an advertising and sponsorship program that we've developed.
So
So,
what is an advertiser pays
business-
for that?
yeah,
Okay.
those were not, that was not district funds that paid for those. So we are looking at creative ways to do things like that.
The Jumbotron
Yes,
basically is what you're referring to?
right, and so that's part of, in the gym, that was purchased so that there would be a venue or a spot for businesses, a lot of them are local businesses, to purchase sponsorship and advertising, and they pay for that, and then that's money that we're putting back into facilities mainly.
So like when you're emailing stuff, like I probably missed it, but like was that communicated that was paid for that way? Because people question when they see something big like this and then you're like, well, hey, we're like, so when things like that, because we don't know how that stuff gets paid for, like when we got new lights, how did those get paid? People are assuming that's coming out of,
Well, the
The
new lights in the
buckets of
band parking lot were a donation, and that was discussed and acknowledged at a school board meeting.
and that was, but like, is there a way to like communicate that out ahead of time?
I know I did an interview and answered questions
That I
about
knew, but like,
the soccer thing.
is there a way to communicate, because I think there's a lot of questions in the community, like how some of that stuff gets paid for. And I know, I don't know if everybody follows Twitter, and I look at every single Facebook and Twitter that I can possibly get that has anything to do with schools, unless it's sports related, because I don't pay attention to sports, but, I think we're using a lot of communication tools like that, but people have questions about how that stuff gets paid for. Does that make sense?
Sure, yeah.
And like,
Absolutely.
you're thinking that's like a little thing,
No,
but to me,
not at
I'm
all.
like, well, that probably cost, $15,000, where did we get that money from?
Yeah.
And like, you know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've been
So
trying to
I-
find
I
someone to
go
talk
and
school
meet-
finance. I think you're my gal.
You're
I'm trying to find someone to talk school finance. I think I found
about what the community's saying?
Yeah, no.
It
I
was
also
also
hope that people can ask
like
too,
you're asking.
and,
yeah,
That's what I'm gonna ask. Can I ask a question?
no,
Text
I tried.
Write it down. So write it down.
But you know, but I mean, I'm not gonna take, I don't know, I just taking the time to like, okay, well, hey, I see, you know, like the new clocks in the school. How did those come about? Like, who paid for those?
Jared can speak to that,
We use health life safety funds for that.
because they're tied in with our PA system as well, so that's a safety.
So do we, like, I don't know, like, does
Okay.
anyone else care about it? Is there just
Well,
kind of?
no,
I would say we don't know what the questions are without being asked the questions.
Right.
I mean,
So
that's,
if like I send in a question, be like, all right, okay, I see this, who paid for it? Then you send out an email or something to everybody?
well,
I don't know.
Yeah, I'm happy to.
What I found,
I don't know,
so,
do people care? I mean, do you ever, you don't ever
I
get
hope,
questions
I
about
hope, I hope they do.
This is the, I would say this is the
Here.
first question I've had about the clocks, and it's the second one I've had about the scoreboards on the
Yes.
softball and the baseball
Okay.
field.
it is a question that I have wondered myself, and I've had others ask me, I'm like, I don't know.
Yeah.
But last night, interestingly, and this rolls into maybe how do we get word out about the buckets and, you know, like this was, you know, donations, or this was
Yeah.
by the, you know, help me out, the Jumbotron you know, advertising. I'm at the ER with my youngest one last night, and of course, you know, they don't have those nasty shower curtains that, you know, divide people off anymore. They have these mural-like things. Now, those are gonna be more expensive, but at the bottom of it, it was, you know, this divider was paid for by the Department of Carl's philanthropy or
Right.
whatever. And I thought, well, that's really interesting to know, because then I knew that my health insurance dollars and
Didn't pay for that.
didn't pay for that.
Right.
Even though it's a necessity or something, well, it's something that is needed for, you know, patient
Privacy.
privacy. I found it very interesting and like, okay, I knew where at least that came from.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, just throwing that out there.
Sure.
That might help, I don't know.
I guess for us, would that be, this was funded by the education, or by local property taxes? I mean, I guess that's,
How to phrase
I
it.
understand that, that's a good example. I don't know how we would implement something like that, outside of, we're going out to buy a scoreboard, here's how it's paid for, and do that with everything on that level. I guess I'm actually asking.
There would be
Yeah,
a
that's-
lot of notices that would have to go out with that, wouldn't there?
Well, just because we're trying to operate a school district now.
Well, that's what I mean, like,
Yeah.
it would be a burdensome, I mean,
I
not
wouldn't say
burdensome.
burdensome, no. I mean, that's my whole goal of making sense, is to hope people care enough to ask it. So, I mean,
Yeah.
I'm glad we're talking about it, honestly.
I mean, I think for me, I know for you and, you know, for others who I have talked with, people would like to know kind of like what bucket it's coming from and how it's getting paid for. And especially if there are things, you know, like you're saying, like the
Yeah,
the
'cause to
big
me that's like
Like
a
over the top
frivolous.
things that don't
Yeah,
necessarily.
to me that's a
need to be
frivolous
Yeah.
thing that's like not really needed,
but
but I don't buy frivolous things.
at the same time,
It's nice to have.
I can see how it can be seen as frivolous, but I can also see at the same time how it helps to, I don't want to say improve the image of the district, because that's not what I mean, but it helps.
Pride and.
Yes,
Yeah.
we're helping to, you know,
And
helping
yeah.
to maintain our grounds and, you know, prideful of what